This one realization absolutely changed my life. It is the transition from boyhood to manhood, both spiritually, mentally. It's the basis for my understanding now of everything, and it is so simple and yet so profound. So let's kind of dive into it. For a little bit of background here, I've struggled with depression in some way, shape, or form for most of my life. I moved when I was pretty little from beautiful Colorado Springs to a tiny little town in South Dakota, which I affectionately call hell. Okay, that's too strong. But yeah, when you're the new kid in a town and there were like 400 people, everybody hates you. It doesn't matter if you look like them or don't look like them. You're new. I got beat up, I got pushed around, I got made fun of, like anything you can imagine. Now, that's not to be like, oh, pity party for David. There's not much you can do to change those things, right? And I recognize that I am who I am today because of the things that I've been through, and that God never wastes anything. So he has used that for his glory and continues to do so. Fast forward, I was doing my master's at University of Arizona in Tucson, and I was living with a friend and his wife and, renting out a spare bedroom at their house. October 28th, 2014. I walk into my home. I open the door. I can barely walk. Can barely function. I can barely breathe. I am so distraught. The Lady Despair whispers into my ear that it would be so much better for it to end. Sleep after toil, port after stormy seas, death after life does greatly please. I take out my sidearm, my M&P shield. I set it to my temple, and I just think that the only friend I have in the whole world is that bullet. I take the slack out of the trigger. I'm right on the edge. And then something snaps. Thankfully, by the grace of God, obviously I didn't take my life. Here I am, 10 years later. But it would take another 7 years from that point before I came to this realization of what was at the core of my depression and what was really holding me back in terms of growing up and moving forward and moving on. And I know I already said this, but when I say that this is life-changing for me, I am not overstating this one change to my perspective is shaping the direction for my future. So I'm getting out of the military. I'm in transition assistance program right now. I've been in for 14 years now. Will be 15 by the time I actually get out. And I'm very scared, but also excited for what's coming next. And I'm going to be going to apply for PhD programs to study a theology of beauty. And this is largely because of this realization that I have a pastor friend to thank for, even though we're no longer in touch. We had a bit of a falling out, which is a story for another time. But I'm still so thankful to him. And if he ever sees this, man, I'm going to cry. I cannot thank God enough for you, Pastor Stewart. No matter, where we ended up in our final conversations and everything else, so thankful because of this. So, he was my counselor when I was living in Virginia, and he gave me this book, or recommended this book by A. Craig Troxel, called With All Your Heart. And Troxel's book, I've written now my own book based on the understandings from that. You can actually read sections of it on my blog if you want to check that out. It's in the show notes at the bottom. But Troxel talks about an ancient understanding of who we are as humans and a recovery of an old Hebrew notion of who we are. And the ancient Hebrews would have understood human beings to be made up of three essential elements: the affections, the intellect, and the will. Well, what I realized when I was having my counseling sessions with Pastor Stewart was that I had for decades, because of our society's obsession with emotion, and I think honestly it's only gotten worse, I had understood our essential elements to be emotion, intellect, and will. And this is fundamentally incorrect, because the emotions are not central to who we are as people. Emotions are symptoms that stem from the affectional core, but they are not themselves central to who we are. And in the military, like we talk about, the spiritual pillar, the emotional pillar, the physical pillar, in order to think about resiliency. The problem is your emotions can never be a pillar because they are not stable. They're never stable. Your emotions change day to day, sometimes minute to minute. And when you're trying to create a foundation in the emotions, you will always be on shifting sands, because that is the nature of emotion. They are highly changeable. That doesn't mean they don't matter and that we need to entirely throw them out. That's not the point. The Stoics get that wrong when they're like, oh, we want to be emotionless. No, that's stupid. What you need to do is recognize that the emotions are symptoms that you can use to diagnose affectional problems. And the affections are the innermost desires of the heart. They are real love. Now, love produces emotion, but love is not itself emotion. And this is, for me, was just foundationally huge, because when I think about my depression, I was depressed for so long that it became a source of identity for me. And that's because I thought that emotion was central to being human, as opposed to recognizing the emotions as symptomatic of other issues in the heart. And this is, James talks about this in the book of James when he says, why are there quarrels and fights among you? Is it not because you want and do not have? That's an affections problem. It's a what we love problem. Our affections are much more stable. Now, they can change and they will change over the course of your life, but your emotions, you have no control over. So every time someone tells you to control your emotions or regulate your emotions, they misunderstand what emotions are. And this is where my PhD work is going to be going. This is the direction that my whole life is taking. It's the direction of the channel. When I talk about work, wisdom, and wonder, I'm talking about the three practical outflows of the affections, the intellect, and the will. Work for the will, wisdom for the intellect, and wonder for the affections. This is how we are constituted, and this is how we, as men and as Christians more broadly, can actually align ourselves with God. Because there are three transcendentals, the three big picture, largest things that are God's qualities in the world. And those are beauty, truth, and goodness. Well, guess what? The will is aligned to be directed towards goodness. The intellect is directed towards truth. And the affections are directed toward and by beauty. So to go back to my struggles with depression, which by the grace of God, that night committed that I would never take my own life, not for any reason, that ultimately it was up to God to take me when He would. And I made that commitment that night. And by His grace, I've stuck with that. And I've seen serious growth from that. But it took another 7 years and this realization for me to be on my knees before the Lord in final recognition of what was at the core of my depression. And this is where I probably make a lot of people angry. At the core of my depression, and probably at the core of yours, if you are a man and depressed, is sin. It is an idolatry of self that says, I don't want God to be God. I want to be God. I want control. I want my way. I want to be worshipped. That's really what it comes down to. He's king, but I want to be king instead. And when that is the central desire of your heart, to actually be God, and you may never admit that to yourself, but I had to. I had to admit it to myself. I remember distinctly, it was 2021, on my knees, on the verge of 2022, realized that night God just punched me in the face with it, that my sin was the sin of David with Bathsheba. Not just, the sexual aspect of it, but sexual sin has always been tied with idolatry in Scripture. And ultimately, what King David did in that moment was he said, but I'm king, and right now I want what I want. Go get her. I want her. And in that moment, he basically took an assassination attempt on God. Now, of course, it doesn't work out anytime we try to take an assassination attempt on God, but that is what our rebellion is. And that realization just put me on my knees. I mean, I was weeping there. It broke me in all of the best ways. And because it broke me, I am now able to understand things in a way that I didn't before. So when I think about that sin, that pride, that desire to be God, that desire to be king, there is a godly kind of idea at the center that ties with our manhood. We are supposed to be in dominion. We are supposed to be kings. We are supposed to be protectors and providers and punishers, right? That's kind of the role of kingship, is protect, provide, and punish. The kind of three subordinate roles under kings. This is what we are called to be as men, but in lesser forms, because we are not meant to be God. We are meant to be bearers of God's authority and dominion into the world, and to accurately submit to Him and then reflect His glory and His kingship to the rest of the world. And when we instead try to put ourselves on the pinnacle, guess what? Every single encounter we ever have is going to conspire against us believing that we are God. All of those things will end in despair. Necessarily, because they do not align with the reality of existence. And the reality is you are not God. So this is at the core of this fundamental shift in my mentality, is the recognition that it is not emotion that drives us. It is not emotion that is central to being human. What matters is affection. The emotions are only useful insofar as they can be used to reveal what is going on in the deepest recesses of your heart. So if you're feeling depressed, guess what? That's fine, right? You can't control how you feel. You can control what you think about it and what you do about it, and you can use it to assess, what is it that I love that I'm not getting? And then second question, is it godly to love that thing? And if the answer is no, how do I love something else? How do I love what is godly instead? Godly desires through a wise mind, out into the world through good work for His glory. You know what, men? Get help from brothers in the faith. Find mentors, find a spiritual mentor. Talk to your pastor, talk to your father. And if you're not blessed with a good father, talk with your heavenly Father, of course, through prayer. And feel free to reach out to me. I would love to talk to any men out there. If you've struggled with depression, if you're there now, as much as it's strange to say now, I am glad I walked through depression, so that maybe one of you out there can be encouraged that there is a light on the other side, that God has not let you go, that He has a plan for your life, and that ultimately He will have His glory in your life, and you can fight for Him, and you will do well. That's it. Soli Deo Gloria.